Hi, my name is Serena Sanders, and today we're going to discuss dissociative identity disorder. In this presentation, I will define dissociation, I will briefly touch on topics and the history of dissociative identity disorder, I will discuss the onset, diagnosis, and the treatment for dissociative identity disorder. Dissociation has four main meanings. The only one that we're concerned with for dissociative identity disorder is postulated intrapsychic defense mechanism. This is a self-defense mechanism within your brain. It tells us exactly why and how your brain processes trauma. In 1791, there was a German woman who was believed to be the first DID case. This is because she was a German woman who one day started speaking French perfectly. She had no recollection of being French, speaking French, or even knowing French. In 1944, there were only 44 cases of DID. In 1952, the DSM-1 was published. Within the DSM-1, DID was categorized under psychoneurotic disorders. In 1956 and 1957, the movie and book was released for Three Faces of Eve. This was a movie within the media that explained and explored DID. In 1968, the DSM-2 was published. Within the DSM-2, DID was identified under a new name, hysterical neurosis dissociative type. Between 1973 and 1976, the movie Sybil was released. It was about a woman named Shirley Mason who was believed to have multiple personalities. In 1979, there were only 200 reported cases of DID. In 1980, the DSM-3 was released. Dissociation became its own category within the DSM-3. By 1984, there were 1,000 cases reported of DID. By 1989, there were 4,000 cases. By 1991, it was believed that 1% of the population, or 2.5 million Americans specifically, will have or will be affected by DID. In 1994, the DSM-4 was published. The big change here is that DID became its official name instead of multiple personality disorder. By 1995, there were 40,000 cases of DID. Jumped several years into 2013, the DSM-5 was published. The big changes here for the DSM-5 from the DSM-4 for DID was that now the patient could self-refer. Most patients with DID have experienced childhood trauma. By childhood trauma, I mean sexual assault, sexual abuse, physical assault, or neglect in very extreme cases. Because this disorder is so complex and very difficult to pinpoint and test, the diagnosis goes untreated or misdiagnosed for several years, on average 4 to 7 years. Because of this, DID is commonly misdiagnosed under PTSD, borderline personality disorder, or schizophrenia. However, schizophrenia does not have split personalities despite common misconception. Another misconception is that DID is the same as repression. However, repression is very different. Repression is taking something from your conscious memory and moving it to your unconscious memory. Dissociation is having two consciousness personalities or identities where one remembers one thing and the other does not remember that same thing. This is because both personalities feel they have experienced something completely different. With multiple personality disorder, or DID, many patients experience life very differently. By this I mean each personality is different. One personality could be male, whereas the main personality or the original personality would be female, or they are different race, gender, sex, however you want to see it. Because DID is a reaction to an environmental cause and is not biological, treatment is very different for every patient. Because it's environmental, you would treat it with an environmental interaction versus a medication. Many psychologists believe psychotherapy or hypnosis to be the best course of action. For many psychologists that don't believe DID is an actual disorder, they treat with benign neglect, which basically means if they don't encourage the disorder will go away. In this presentation, I cover the definition of dissociation, the form of dissociation that we would be covering, I cover the onset, the diagnosis, and the treatment.